They called it a golden age, an era of poetry and power, when Queen Elizabeth I reigned from the year 1558 until 1603. But beneath the glimmering court portraits and theatrical sonnets, beneath the voyages of conquest and the towering sails of empire, there was something far more human, far more poignant, and far less poetic. The food, and not the romanticized kind, but the kind that rotted faster than secrets in a royal court. To understand the Elizabethan world, one must not look only to the throne or the theatre, but to the table, the kitchen, and the bones buried beneath bread crusts, too dark for the sun to lighten. Because what people ate, what they had to eat, was a mirror of their suffering, their status, and their sheer will to survive. While the nobles feasted in velvet-trimmed halls under chandeliers of candlelight, their banquets were often more of a spectacle than a source of nourishment.
To Queen Elizabeth, long live the Queen!
These meals were dripping in sugar, quite literally. Sugar was the crown jewel of the Elizabethan diet, imported from the New World and treasured like gold. It wasn't just used in desserts. It adorned meats, shaped sculptures, and blackened teeth with such frequency that tooth rot became a fashion statement. Yes, you read that right. Rotten teeth were sexy. To have a darkened smile was to flaunt your access to the luxury of decay. Queen Elizabeth herself, according to whispers passed between courtiers and chroniclers, lost so many teeth in her later years that her speech became hard to decipher. Yet this wasn't viewed as weakness, it was a symbol of high status, like a velvet robe stitched with worms. But while sugar was the poison of the privileged, meat was its own kind of danger. The wealthy consumed it in alarming quantities. Beef, pork, veal, mutton, venison, rabbit, goose, swan, and peacock. It was common to serve multiple animals in a single course, their skins stuffed with spices, and their carcasses dressed for display. Peacocks, with their flamboyant feathers, were not just eaten but reassembled after roasting, their bright plumes sewn back onto cooked bodies for shock and awe. Presentation trumped preservation. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled fast. And spices were not simply flavor enhancers, they were desperate attempts to mask the stench of rot. Ginger, mustard, cinnamon, garlic, and marigold weren't just culinary, they were camouflage. A slab of rotting venison, add cloves. A duck past its prime, soak it in almond milk or red wine until the taste of death becomes more subtle. And yet, even among the elite, this performance of luxury exacted a price. The same meats that impressed guests led to chronic kidney stones, painful urinary tract infections, and digestive chaos. Vegetables were viewed as food for commoners. Grains were scorned. To eat like a king, ironically, was to suffer like a prisoner in one's own body. And it didn't stop at the table. Food waste, while common today, was frowned upon in Tudor times. Every bone, every crust, every last sliver of jellied fat was repurposed. Servants were given leftovers, not out of kindness, but because even the noble class understood that letting meat rot uneaten was both a moral sin and an economic foolishness. A rotting peacock was bad, a rotting reputation worse. But if the nobles were dining on spectacle, the poor were scraping together survival. A typical peasant's meal was humble, predictable, and profoundly uninspired, brown or black bread made from coarse rye or barley, a chunk of crumbly cheese, and maybe, on a good day, a meat or vegetable pie. White bread, made from fine flour, was a luxury reserved for the rich, and its pale color alone signaled class. The color of your bread was your social rank, made edible the lower you stood in the social ladder, the darker your loaf became. And yet, in village, Across England, people gathered around shared ovens, communal hearths that baked dozens of loaves at once for families too poor to own private stoves. Housewives would knead dough in the early hours, mark their initials on the crust, and hope the baker wouldn't mix up their loaf with someone else's. This was not culinary romance. It was logistical warfare, fought with dough and ash. Things didn't get better in the cities. In London, markets were heavily regulated. If you weren't a registered citizen, you couldn't sell your goods. Country farmers were forbidden from bringing produce to urban stalls. Visitors could buy, but not sell. Milk had a tight schedule, sold only in early morning hours on Sunday. Because it wouldn't last till Monday, street vendors shouted their offerings beside carts. But shops were so small that buyers often had to call out their orders from the street, never stepping foot inside. And even then, the price of food could land you in trouble. Officials roamed the markets, watching for cheats, ready to punish those who dared to sell a cabbage too dearly. Then there were the laws, strange, specific, and inescapable. Queen Elizabeth issued a mandate that everyone eat fish on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. Ostensibly, it was to support England's fishing industry. Secretly, some believe it was part of her personal dietary experiment. Regardless, breaking the rule could result in prison 3 months behind bars for a slab of beef on the wrong day. But here's the kicker. Fish was loosely defined. Chicken and duck were somehow acceptable substitutes. But red meat was off limits. In a nation where eating the wrong protein could send you to jail, the dinner table was a political minefield, and through it all, one thing remained constant. Water was deadly, contaminated with typhoid, cholera, and other unseen monsters. It was safer to drink ale. Yes, even for children. Mild ales were a daily staple, while stronger ones were favored by adults looking to dull the edge of a hard life. Wine, rare and outrageously expensive, was 12 times the price of ale, and mostly reserved for the elite. A child could drink beer, but not water. A queen could sip wine, but not trust it. In that world, alcohol wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. So, when we picture Elizabethan England, we often imagine pearls, putri, and powdered wigs. But the truth was darker, greasier, and far more rotten. The kingdom ran on meals wrapped in spectacle and survival. To eat was to define yourself, to show your status, your worth, even your allegiance. And whether you were biting into a sugar-sculpted swan or gnawing on crusty rye beside a smoky communal oven, you weren't just feeding your body, you were feeding the story of who you were. In a world where even food could betray you, and as the meat turned grey and the sugar blackened your smile, you swallowed it all because there was no other choice. Not in Elizabeth's England, somewhere in the smoky shadows of a 16th century kitchen, just beyond the scent of meat fat dripping into open flame and the slow crackle of burning logs, there was a wheel turning, not turned by man, nor machine, but by a creature bred for servitude, legs short and spine long, eyes dull with repetition. They called it the turnspit dog, small, low to the ground, shaped like a furry sausage with anxious paws. This breed was born for one task alone, to run inside a wooden wheel all day long, spinning the spit that held slabs of beef, pork, or venison, ensuring the meat browned evenly while noble mouths waited on the other side of the wall. It is one thing to imagine a dog turning dinner. It is quite another to realize an entire species of canine was engineered to fuel the appetite of Tudor kitchens, and that this grim contraption was considered, at the time, a clever and even humane innovation. Because before the turnspit dog, it was the children who were burdened with the thankless task of turning meat over flames. Their arms would cramp, their skin would blister from the heat, and their minds would wander dangerously A single lapse meant undercooked meat, embarrassment, or worse, but a dog obedient, tireless, and bred without options did not complain. Their little legs moved in circles for hours, keeping the feast alive. In the great homes and inns of England, these dogs were as common in the kitchen as the knives or ladles. They were not pets, they were tools, and when they grew too old or lame to run, they were often discarded like any broken utensil. It is said the breed is now extinct, and maybe that's for the best. Because no creature should be born solely to serve the fire, but while the dog turned the meat in the great halls, the people outside the castle walls had no time for spectacle or spit. They boiled. They fried. They baked when they could, but roasting, with its need for time, fouille, and fresh meat, was a luxury. Most common folk used cauldrons suspended over hearth fires, where soups and stews bubbled for hours, thickened with whatever was available: onions, cabbage, the occasional root vegetable, and sometimes, if fortune allowed, a scrap of bacon or fish. These stews were rarely seasoned with anything beyond salt or parsley, and often carried the tang of smoke and desperation. If the rich dined to impress, the poor dined to endure. In village life, the oven itself was often shared. Few homes had the space or resources to build private brick ovens. So, a communal baking space became a necessity. Women would prepare their dough in the quiet hours of early morning, shaping it by hand, marking the tops with initials or symbols carved into the crust, and carrying their trays covered in cloth, filled with dark loaves or simple pies, to the village oven. There, the local baker, hired by the community or granted the right to operate by the local lord, would oversee the baking. Dozens of loaves would be placed into the great maw of the oven, all glowing with the promise of sustenance. Hours later, the women would return, hoping their markings had not burned away, hoping no richer neighbor had claimed the better baked loaf. Even in the act of feeding, hierarchy crept in. And yet, hunger did not always care for rules. Leftovers from noble tables, scraps from fishmongers and butchers, the marrowbones and skin trimmings of the wealthy, often found their way to the poor. Whether given out of Christian guilt or economic logic, this trickle-down feeding created a silent ecosystem of survival. A roast left unfinished at court might become soup for 10. A swan too tough for noble teeth might soften overnight into the stew pot of a servant's family. Waste was sin. Utilization was wisdom. Every part of the animal was used, from the tongue to the tail, from liver to lung. Each part boiled, fried, or buried in pie crust. And while ovens and spit roasts shaped the texture of food, the rules of the day shaped its meaning. There were laws, strict and peculiar, about what could be eaten and when. Queen Elizabeth decreed that fish must be eaten 3 days a week on Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, not for reasons of faith, but to protect the English fishing trade. In theory, it was an act of patriotism. In practice, it was a culinary trap. While the definition of fish stretched absurdly to include fowl such as duck or goose, beef remained forbidden. Eating it on a fish day could land you in prison for up to 3 months. Imagine a nation where a misplaced dinner choice could steal away a season of your life. In the homes of the cautious, menus were adjusted. In the kitchens of the careless, meat was hidden or renamed. And in the taverns, laughter swelled around plates of river chicken, a not-so-subtle code for meat served against the Queen's rules. In London, food rules took on another shape. Markets were strictly controlled. Only free citizens could sell goods, and country visitors were barred from doing so. Even the sale of perishables was restricted by day and hour. Milk, for instance, was only sold on Sunday mornings, before it could sour. Those who missed the hour missed the milk. Fruit and vegetables, meanwhile, had short windows. The city was a maze of stalls, carts, and corner shouts. A woman might buy eggs by yelling through a window. A man might haggle for bread in the street. And everywhere, the law watched, ensuring no one charged too much for the basics: bread, salt, grain. Food was not only fuel, it was a currency, a crime, a code. Back in the kitchens of the elite, where the turnspit dogs still ran in their circles, the priorities were different. Taste mattered, but appearance mattered more. Meals were designed to dazzle, not satisfy. Bright flowers like violets and marigolds were used to season meats. Gold leaf was occasionally laid over pastries. Animals were roasted, then dressed again in their feathers or fur, posed as if alive. Peacocks returned to the table, heads lifted by skewers, wings spread in death's parody. Sugar was poured over everything, not only to sweeten, but to signal wealth. Sugar was sculpted into swans, castles, chessboards. The more elaborate the sugar, the higher the status of the host. In some banquets, sugar birds sat beside real birds, and guests were invited to eat the decoration if they dared. The taste was secondary. The symbolism was everything. Yet even in the shadow of such feasts, one truth held: food, no matter how extravagant or humble, was a daily reminder of one's place in the world. The dog in the wheel ran without choice. The baker served without margin. The noble dined with polish, but paid in blood and stone. And every citizen, from the highest courtier to the lowest scullion, navigated their days not by clock, but by hunger, because in Elizabethan England, food was not just what went into your mouth, it was how you were seen, where you belonged, and whether you lived to see another season. Meals were not memories. They were battles. Some were won with spit-roasted spectacle. Others were endured with scorched crust and thinned ale. But all of them, whether served in gold-plated halls or ladled into clay bowls by firelight, tell us the same story. To eat in this era was to negotiate power, poverty, survival, and sometimes, if you were lucky enough not to be the one running the wheel, to taste a little moment of peace. In the silent corners of Elizabeth's court, where candles burned low and tapestries muffled the sound of footsteps, there existed a sweetness that didn't belong to childhood or joy. It belonged to power. It belonged to death. And it began not in a bakery or kitchen, but on ships that crossed oceans with sails swollen by wind and greed, bearing with them not only gold, but something more seductive: refined sugar, bright as bone dust and just as costly. This was not the sugar of modern kitchens, spooned into coffee or sprinkled over cereal. This was the sugar that crowned kings and rotted queens, that whispered of empire and decay in the same breath, that glittered in candlelight and blackened in the mouths of those who could afford it. To eat sugar in the 16th century was not merely to indulge, it was to ascend. It marked you as wealthy, worldly, and wasteful in all the right ways. The poor might chew on coarse bread and turn to honey for flavor, but sugar belonged to the upper crust, both literally and symbolically. It adorned the tables of the nobility, not only in tarts and confections, but in the form of elaborate sculptures molded into swans, dogs, mythical creatures, and entire castles. These sugarworks stood like edible trophies at banquets, often uneaten, more important as decoration than sustenance. Their fragility mirrored the political power structures of the time: beautiful, hollow, and built to collapse. The artisans who created these sugar masterpieces were part chef, part sculptor, and part sorcerer. They worked with boiled syrups and hardened molds, shaping sweetness into symbols of dominance. It was common for noble hosts to commission elaborate sugar tableaux for feasts, their guests marveling at animals carved from sweetness and birds, whose feathers were replaced with spun sugar lace. Children were not invited to these displays. These were not for play. They were performances of wealth so intense. They bordered on intimidation. Every sugary animal, every tower of glazed fruit or candied almond, was a warning this family. This name could afford to burn sugar like coal, to devour gold and call it dessert. But what sugar gave with one hand, it took with the other. In the mouths of the elite, it left blackened teeth, symbols of rot disguised as glamour. The very thing that made them enviable also made them suffer. Queen Elizabeth herself, by the end of her reign, was rumoured to have lost many of her teeth. Court whispers told of her difficulty speaking, of the way her words became slurred not from wine, but from the absence of enamel. Her lips, once commanding, curled around gaps and pain. She was not alone. Toothaches plagued the aristocracy, some too proud to admit their agony, others bragging of it as if it were a badge of honour, because black teeth meant sugar, and sugar meant status. In a twist that history could only deliver with a straight face, this painful decline became a trend. The lower classes, unable to afford enough sugar to genuinely rot their teeth, began mimicking the appearance of decay. Some chewed charcoal or rubbed their teeth with soot to give the illusion of blackened molars. Others painted on darkness with ink or lead. A smile riddled with fake rot was better than one that appeared healthy. It meant you had access to sugar, even if only in fantasy. In this strange inversion of health and wealth, sickness became beauty, and decay became desirable. Beyond appearances, sugar twisted its way into the structure of Elizabethan meals. Unlike modern dining customs, where dessert waits patiently at the end, sweet courses in Tudor feasts arrived between savoury ones. A strange rhythm of meat and marzipan, of fowl and fruit paste. A roast could be followed by a cherry tart, then another meat dish, then a sugar sculpture passed from hand to hand like a sacred relic. The final course of these banquets was rarely a cake or pie. Instead, it might be a handful of candied nuts or a plate of cheese. Simple fare to conclude a symphony of extravagance. But even these endings whispered of class. The cheese was aged, the nuts imported, the tableware ornate, and yet, despite all its elegance, sugar was a killer in disguise. Dental decay was only the beginning. The overconsumption of rich, sweet foods combined with a meat-heavy diet and lack of fresh vegetables contributed to kidney stones, stomach illnesses, and even mental distress. The court physicians, lacking the knowledge of modern science, diagnosed such ailments with vague phrases, humours out of balance, vapours of the spleen. They prescribed honeyed syrups and herbal teas, never suspecting that the sugar they so revered was gnawing away at the very people who funded them. In the homes of the middle class and working poor, sugar was rare and revered. A small bag could last a year. It was hoarded, measured, and brought out only for special occasions, weddings, births, saints' days. Mothers might save it to sprinkle over a child's first pie. Bakers used it sparingly in festival breads. When someone died, sugar was sometimes offered to guests as a sign of respect and wealth, a sweet farewell to a life spent chasing survival. It was too expensive for everyday use, too sacred to waste, and in that rarity, it retained its power. But the truth behind sugar's rise was darker still. Its journey to English tables was paved in colonization, in plantations across the Caribbean and the Americas, in hands that were shackled and bloodied long before they ever touched cane. The sweetness enjoyed in Tudor halls was extracted through labour so brutal. It would haunt history for centuries, and though England had not yet built the full machinery of empire, the seeds were already being sown in the taste buds of its elite, in the blackened smiles of its queens, in the gold-rimmed cups passed from one powdered hand to another. To sit at a sugar-laden table in the age of Elizabeth was to participate in a silent exchange wealth for pain. beauty for decay, indulgence for suffering. The guests clapped and marvelled, unaware or uncaring of the cost. The queen smiled, though her teeth ached, and the sculpted swans remained frozen mid-song, their wings made not of feathers, but of lies. Now, as you rest and drift towards sleep, imagine that banquet table, long and heavy, lined with glittering plates and dimmed candles. Imagine the statues of sugar, the peacocks reassembled with false feathers, the nobles sipping wine through teeth stained black. Imagine the silence between courses, the heavy scent of marzipan and meat, the echo of a laugh too sharp to be sincere. Imagine the crown not gold, but laced with sweetness, turned sour, and ask yourself, was it worth it? Close your eyes now. Let the sugar dissolve on your tongue, sweet at first, but with something bitter underneath. That is the taste of history. That is the taste of power. Not all bread was born equal. In the world of Queen Elizabeth, the loaf on your table told a story about your name, your labour, your blood, and your place beneath the crown. Bread was more than food. It was a quiet form of social branding, a symbol baked with flour, class, and centuries of hierarchy. To hold a slice of white bread in your hands was to hold proof of your status. To dew dark, coarse crusts was to be reminded of your position. In the 16th century, before surnames carried prestige, and before bank accounts measured worth, bread did it for you, and it did not lie. The wealthy dined on what was known as mancetta fine, pale bread made from the softest part of sifted wheat flour. It was delicate, light in colour, soft in the middle, with a barely crisp crust kissed by the heat of expensive ovens. Only the finest grains could make such a loaf, and only the richest could afford it. Manchet was served in courtly meals beside silver goblets and carved meats, cut into slices with ivory-handled knives, often discarded half-eaten by those too full of roasted game and sugar-draped sweets. But that waste was a luxury too, because they could. Meanwhile, in the crooked houses of the working class, where wind seeped through the timber cracks, and children warmed their hands beside smoking hearths, the bread was darker, made from rye, barley, oats, or whatever grain could be milled cheaply. This was maslin bread, or horse bread, thick and heavy, coarse to the touch and to the gut. It filled the stomach but left the soul hollow. It did not rise like white bread. It sat, a dense weight in the hand and in the belly. For many labourers, this bread was breakfast, lunch, and supper, eaten cold with onion, dipped in broth, crumbled over what little stew remained in the pot. It did not flatter. It endured. This line between white and brown bread, so stark and visible, became more than just a matter of taste. It became law. In some towns, bakers were required to mark their bread with stamps to identify the grain used. Fraudulent white bread, if discovered, could be punished, not because it threatened health, but because it threatened the social order. A poor man eating rich bread was seen not as lucky, but suspicious. A baker who sold white bread to the lower classes risked not only fines, but reputation, because in this society, everyone needed to know their place, and their place was announced in every bite. Yet despite these rules, despite the flour inspections and price fixings, hunger ignored the law. Families scraped together coins to buy half a loaf. Children walked barefoot to market at dawn, hoping for crumbs. In some towns, poor women were permitted to bake communal bread in shared ovens. They brought their dough wrapped in cloth, each loaf marked with a family symbol or an etched cross. The ovens, usually stone, wide-mouthed, glowing red, were tended by bakers who rotated loaves, watching not only for doneness, but for theft, because one well-baked loaf could feed a family for days. and one missing loaf could spark a fight that outlasted the fire. In times of grain shortages, things grew desperate. Bread riots broke out. Bakers were accused of hoarding flour, of watering down dough, of selling smaller loaves at higher prices. The authorities responded by mandating a size of bread laws, measures designed to regulate the size and cost of a loaf based on the price of wheat. But enforcement was uneven. In rural villages, the word of such laws travelled slowly, and bread continued to shrink while hunger grew. In cities, the watchmen patrolled markets, inspecting bread baskets, weighing loaves, ensuring no citizen was cheated. Still, corruption found a way, and bread remained the one product where even fraud had a flavour. For those who lived in service maids, porters, apprentices, the bread they received was often leftovers from the master's table, uniatamangshits, half-sliced loaves, or stale crusts bundled in cloth. These cast-offs were seen as generous acts, but in truth, they were an extension of power, reminding the servant of their dependence and the master of their grace. There was a phrase whispered in kitchens and back alleys: better a noble's crumb than a baker's promise. Because promises didn't fill bellies, but a noble's crumb, however cold or dry, still bore the taste of status. Children grew up learning to read bread the way others read books. They knew the difference between oat bread and rye by feel alone. They could tell who had coin and who had credit by the sheen of flour dust on a tunic. Young girls were taught to knead dough not only with care but with prayer, hoping the oven would rise their fate as much as their loaf. And old women, widows, herbalists, wise ones, shared secrets of stretching dough with boiled roots, binding it with egg from tired hens, and flavouring it with herbs no one would miss. Bread was their currency, their weapon, their inheritance. In court, where feasts stretched for hours and dishes were paraded like soldiers in review, bread played a more subtle role. It was not the star, but it was always present. Thin slices laid beneath meat to catch the juices, crusts used to soak up wine, or as plates for the lower guests. These pieces of trencher bread, once soaked and stained, were sometimes discarded, but more often they were collected and given to the poor, not out of mercy but because even used bread had value. In a kingdom built on appearances, nothing was wasted, not even what had already been chewed. But bread could also be political. In times of unrest, when tax levies grew too heavy or grain shipments were delayed, angry mobs targeted bakers, ovens were smashed, stores looted, bread carts overturned. Because when the people could not afford to eat, they no longer cared who wore the crown. There are records of towns rising up, not over speeches or sermons, but over flour. Revolts that began with hunger and ended with blood. Because in the end, bread is not only about food, it is about control. Take it away, and you take away obedience. And so, as night falls, and you drift into that soft space between sleep and memory, picture not a banquet table or a royal hall, but a village oven glowing in the dark. Picture the women arriving in silence, loaves cradled like children, the smell of yeast and ash rising into the damp morning air. Picture the baker, soot on his cheeks, drawing out loaves with a long wooden paddle, his eyes scanning for theft, his fingers burned from truth. Picture a little girl waiting for her mother's loaf to cool, knowing that inside that crust is the only thing that stands between her and the long, cold hunger of winter. Because in the world of Elizabeth, your bread told your story, and some stories were soft and golden, while others were dark, hard, and barely risen. Sleep now. Let the ovens cool. Let the flour settle. And listen, in the quiet, for the crack of crust and the whispered proof that in this world bread was never just bread. It may seem strange, almost absurd, to think that in a land of royal courts and rotting teeth, of sugar swans and breadline hierarchies. One of the most quietly dangerous acts a person could commit was eating the wrong thing on the wrong day. Not murder, not treason, not heresy, but meat specifically, beef on a Wednesday, or a Friday, or a Saturday. In Elizabethan England, that wasn't dinner, that was defiance. The rule came from the top, passed down by none other than Queen Elizabeth herself. 3 days a week? By royal decree. The people of England were expected to eat fish. Not out of religious obligation, though the practice echoed the old Catholic fasting traditions, but out of something far more earthly: economics. The fishing industry, struggling against waves of war and shifting markets, needed a saviour. And the Queen, with her sharp eyes and sharper policies, decided to legislate appetite. Eat fish. Or else, at first glance, it was a clever move. Fish was plentiful along England's coasts and rivers. The seas teemed with cod, herring, and ale. Inland ponds were stocked with carp and perch. If the people ate more fish, the fishermen would thrive. The trade would grow, and the nation could strengthen one of its most vital industries without firing a single shot. But the law, like so many in that era, quickly lost its reason and took on a logic of its own. Enforcement grew strict, exceptions narrowed, and soon, a single meal could make you a criminal. Imagine a young baker in a damp corner of Norwich, rising before dawn to prepare pies for his neighbours. He's poor. His neighbours are poorer. A local butcher has offered him scraps, bits of beef too thin to sell. Nearly spoiled, but still edible, with enough spice. The baker takes them, seasons them, folds them into dough, and bakes them into steaming pastries. He sells them from a stall on the street, and they disappear into the hands of hungry workers and children who haven't had meat in days. But it's Friday, and the Queen's men are watching. For this simple act, feeding the poor with what he had, the baker could be fined, shamed, or even imprisoned for up to 3 months. Not for poisoning, not for theft, but for violating the fish days. It didn't matter that no one in that crowd could afford eel. It didn't matter that the river had frozen, or that the fisherman's boat had cracked. The law had no taste for circumstance. To complicate matters further, the definition of fish under the law was, to put it kindly, flexible. While beef was absolutely forbidden, poultry like chicken, duck, and goose was somehow allowed, at least in certain regions and under certain interpretations. Some argued that waterfowl counted as fish if they lived near lakes. Others insisted that all birds were land creatures and therefore off limits. The truth changed from town to town, from sheriff to mayor, from parish to priest. What was sacred in one county was suspicious in another. And so, fishmongers prospered not only from their catch, but from their power. They sold their wares with a knowing smile, raising prices as the Queen's fish days approached. Herring that cost a penny on Tuesday might fetch 3 by Friday. The poor paid more for fear of punishment. The rich simply bought more and wasted what they didn't eat. And somewhere in the middle, the butchers seethed, watching their profits bleed into the sea. The irony was not lost on the people. In private, they mocked the law. They gave beef nicknames, wrapped it in euphemisms. A roast might be called coastal lamb. A sausage might be passed as river pudding. Families whispered recipes to one another, codes for survival disguised as cooking tips. But the law listened, and when it found meat on the wrong table, it did not laugh. For those bold or desperate enough to break the rule, the punishments varied. A first offence might warrant a public warning or a fine, but repeated disobedience could lead to time behind bars, where the meals, ironically, were often fishless. In some towns, convicted meat-eaters were forced to kneel in church and confess their sin before the congregation. In others, They were paraded through the streets holding signs that read, "Meat on Friday." Shame was as sharp a sentence as any cell, but there was something deeper beneath the surface of the law. It wasn't just about fish. It was about control, about seeing who would obey without question, and who would push back with a plate of beef. It was about reminding the people that their stomachs did not belong to them, not fully. Their appetites were national property, subject to the tides of trade, the whims of power, the flavor of policy. A nation that could legislate hunger could legislate anything. Yet still, people found ways to resist. Smoked meat was hidden beneath beds. Sausages were buried in jars of brine. Small hams were salted and hung in the rafters like laundry, disguised beneath cloaks of herbs and cloth. Children were taught not to ask questions when they saw meat on the table. If the Queen's men knocked, they were to say, "It was fish." Always fish, even if it had 4 legs and hooves. And the Queen she knew, she must have known. Her court was filled with whispers. Her kitchen, no doubt, experimented with loopholes. But the law remained, as much a tool of image as enforcement. England, to the outside world, was a nation of order, of discipline, of prosperity, and fish, of all things, became the symbol of that illusion. As night falls, and your mind drifts beyond the smoke of Tudor kitchens, beyond the stalls of London markets and the muddy banks of village streams, picture a table, not royal, not poor, just ordinary. A wooden table, scarred by years, set with chipped plates and a single loaf of bread. A mother stands near the hearth. A father lowers his voice. The children wait, silent, watching the steam rise from a pot whose contents are uncertain. It smells like meat. It could be fish. It must be fish, because it's Friday. And outside, the law walks on quiet feet. Sleep now. Let the arguments of fish and meat fade into mist. Let the taste of rebellion dissolve on your tongue. Let the fear pass. Because in the morning, the bread will return. The markets will open. The Queen's men will nod as they pass. And somewhere, someone will eat what they should not. And history, once again, will be written not with ink, but with hunger. Before the morning bells finished echoing off the slanted rooftops of Elizabethan England, the markets were already alive, if alive could mean something cramped, suspicious, and tightly regulated. Wooden carts rolled down uneven streets, wheels shrieking against stone, pushed by hands, blistered not just from farm work, but from frustration. The scent of crushed thyme and muddy radish hung in the air. Chickens clucked in woven baskets. Women shouted prices, sometimes louder than the church bells themselves. But not everyone who had food to sell was allowed to sell it. Not in the great cities. Not in London. Not if you were an outsider. This wasn't just commerce. It was ceremony. You could not wake up. Walk in from the countryside with a basket of apples or a string of onions, and decide to stand beside a market stall and earn your bread. That choice belonged only to the free citizens, a title reserved not for the hard-working, nor the hungry, but for those who had inherited the right to profit from the city's appetite. If you were a farmer from a nearby village, your produce, no matter how fresh, no matter how honest, was not welcome unless it was channeled through the right hands, taxed by the right collectors, and permitted by the city's gatekeepers. The food might have grown in your field, but the profit did not belong to you. At the center of this controlled chaos stood the figure of authority, the Lord Mayor, or his appointed officers armed not with swords, but with lists, seals, and suspicion. Their job was to keep the market fair. But fairness was rarely for the poor. Prices were monitored, loaves were weighed, meat was inspected for rot, and licenses were demanded with the same sternness as passports. A woman who had baked bread all her life in the countryside feeding her family and trading with neighbors, could be turned away with a wave of a hand and a muttered accusation. Not registered. The city did not care for experience. It cared for paper, seal, and bloodline. And if someone dared to break the rule, to set up a cart without approval, the punishment was swift and public. Goods were confiscated, sometimes trampled. Fines were issued, often more than what the entire cart of goods was worth. In some cases, the offender was locked in the stocks. A cabbage seller turned into a street-side spectacle, mocked for the crime of trying to live. A week's harvest ruined in minutes. A month's hope gone before noon. Even the timing of the market was regulated. Perishable goods, such as milk, could only be sold during certain hours on certain days, early Sunday morning being the most coveted window. If you missed it, if your cow gave milk too late, or your cart wheel broke, or your child was sick, you were simply out of luck. No exceptions, no sympathy. The market waited for no one, especially not those who needed it most. And yet, the market was everything. It was the lifeblood of the city, the stage upon which survival was performed daily. Here, gossip spread faster than disease. Here, alliances were formed and broken over the price of eggs. Here, a crooked scale could determine whether a child went to bed full or hungry. There were no second chances. If your apples were bruised, no one looked twice. If your fish smelled faintly wrong, customers vanished like mist. Reputation clung to vendors like sweat, and once it soured, it was nearly impossible to wash off. For women, the stakes were even higher. Many of the stalls were run by widows, mothers, and young girls whose hands knew the weight of turnips and the cost of every coin. For them, the market was not just work, it was protection, independence, identity. But one argument with a guard, one missed payment, one false accusation, and a woman could lose her place at the stall forever. Then what begging, sewing for pennies marriage, if she were lucky, and even then, to whom a man who thought selling onions was beneath him, until the rent came due, and all the while, the richer merchants sold from real shops small, windowless holes built into stone buildings, so cramped that customers rarely entered. Instead, they stood outside, called through shutters, and waited as goods were passed through gaps like secrets. There was no browsing, no touching. You knew what you needed, or you left with nothing. These shopkeepers had names carved in ledgers and relationships with guilds. They did not shout in the street. They did not barter with peasants. Their hands stayed clean, and their prices stayed high. The system, of course, protected itself. If you wanted in, if you dreamed of setting up a permanent stall, you needed patronage, papers, and often a bribe. Without it, you remained an outsider, locked in a cycle of temporary allowances and whispered warnings. Some tried to cheat the system by pretending to be citizens, forging tokens or borrowing names, but the punishment for forgery was severe, and most didn't risk it. They knew the law did not bend for hungry hands. And so, the countryside seller remained on the margins, allowed to walk the streets, allowed to spend, but not to sell. She might watch her vegetables wilt in the sun, while nearby stalls sold inferior goods for twice the price. She might weep quietly as her milk soured in the jug. She might curse the city and its iron grip. But curses did not buy bread, and tomorrow she would rise again, pack her cart, and hope for a break. A whisper of mercy. A guard who looked away instead of toward her. As the sun set, the market changed. The cries of vendors softened. The crowd thinned. The air grew heavier. Some stalls folded for the day. Others, the black market ones, opened. Meat that hadn't passed inspection. Bread that had been underweighed. fish caught from the wrong stream. This shadow market, though illegal, pulsed with desperation and defiance. The people who came here didn't care about laws, they cared about living. And you, as you drift into sleep, I may wonder what it felt like to walk those streets, to carry a basket of eggs, knowing you had no right to sell them, to look into the eyes of a crying child and explain why the cabbage you grew could not be traded for bread, to stand in a crowd of hundreds, all shouting, sweating, dealing, and feel utterly invisible. Because in Elizabethan England, you were not what you had, you were what they allowed you to have. And if you were lucky, if you were quiet, if you didn't push too hard, maybe, just maybe, they'd let you sell your own food. Close your eyes now. Picture the stalls being packed away. The crates, the knives, the buckets of rainwater used to rinse off shame. Picture the mother walking home, her cart half full, her purse nearly empty. Picture her child asleep in the hay, dreaming of apples never sold. And remember this sometimes. The harshest prisons have no walls at all, only rules. And rotting fruit. There is a quiet kind of terror in needing a drink not for celebration, not for pleasure, but for survival. In Elizabethan England, that terror was not whispered or hidden. It floated in the bottom of every mug and pitcher, in the foamy rims of tankards, and the sweet bite of poorly aged ale. It was a truth so widely accepted that no one questioned it anymore. If you drank water, you were risking your life. If you drank only, you were merely risking your balance. And so, in a twist only history could make seem ordinary, an entire kingdom drank alcohol to stay alive day and night. Rich and poor, old and young, even children. The rivers were not safe. The wells were not pure. Water, that most basic of human needs, was tainted by a world that did not yet understand germs, but knew too well the consequences of filth. Waste from houses, from markets, from slaughterhouses, flowed freely into the same streams that were supposed to quench thirst. Diseases we now call typhoid and cholera were ghosts, then unnamed, invisible, but felt with every fever and every funeral. People learned quickly, almost instinctively, that those who drank from the wrong place grew pale and quiet and died. But ale was safer. Not pure, not clean, but safer. The brewing process, however, crude boiled the liquid, killing many of the lurking dangers, and so it became the default. Ale with breakfast, ale with supper, or between tasks, in moments of rest, in moments of mourning. Children sipped from cups, no bigger than their palms. Women carried jugs to market, their handles polished by fingers curled around habit. Men gathered in taverns not just for camaraderie, but for protection, because to drink together was to survive together. Of course, not all ales were equal. Some were thin and watery, brewed quickly, consumed fresh, barely stronger than modern tea. These were the small ales, mild enough for children, for servants, for labourers who needed clarity more than numbness. Other ales, richer and longer fermented, carried a sharper sting and a heavier weight. These were for the grown, for the weary, for those who had the time or the pain to drink slowly. And then there was wine, floating high above them all, shimmering in goblets and guarded behind locked cellars, reserved for the elite, not just for its taste, but for what it signified: wealth, class, civilization. Wine was 12 times more expensive than ale. It was imported, hoarded, and poured with ceremony. The Queen herself drank it. Spanish wine, French vine, fortified and aged, pressed from grapes grown far from the mud of England's farms. To sip it was to declare one's distance from the common folk. A man who drank wine could afford not only sugar and meat, but time itself, time to be idle, to be indulgent, to drink something that was never meant to quench thirst, only to confirm power. In contrast, the alehouses and taverns of the towns were loud and low-roofed, full of steam and laughter, arguments and deals. There were no menus, no bartenders in starched sleeves. A woman might serve you, or a boy, or a bearded man who brewed the ale himself in the same room where he slept. The mugs were wooden, the tables sticky, the floor scattered with straw to soak up spills and other things. But it was there, in those dark corners, that stories were told and secrets traded. It was there that a soldier nursed a pint after a battle, that a midwife took her first drink after a long night, that a farmer toasted the harvest, and a widow the end of another year survived. And yet, for all its necessity, alcohol had its costs. It dulled more than just pain. It blurred the edge between truth and trouble. A man could lose a coin, a friend, or a night in the haze of too much ale. Brawls broke out. Promises were made and forgotten. Marriages began and ended beneath the same dripping rafters. The church warned of excess, of course, but softly, carefully. Even priests drank ale. Even bishops preferred wine. And the poor, who had nothing else to drink, could hardly be blamed for reaching for the only cup that didn't carry disease. For some, alcohol was more than habit. It was escape. From hunger, from grief, from the weight of laws and the cold of winter. A husband, broken from work, might drink to silence the aches that no healer could cure. A wife, worn thin from childbirth and duty, might sip to ease her breath. The ale did not fix anything, but for a moment, it loosened the world's grip. And sometimes, that was enough. Even children, born into a world of thirst and fear, learned to drink small ale with their meals. It was not seen as corruption. But kare, a child who drank water might grow sick. A child who drank ale might sleep. There were lullabies and legends sung over sips, tales of kings and harvests, of rivers that flowed with honey, of lands where water could be trusted. The children listened, blinking slowly, the warmth of ale in their bellies replacing the sharpness of reality. In noble households, where the table was long and the cups were carved, wine came with rituals. It was served in silver, sometimes warmed, sometimes spiced. A steward poured, a guest bowed, and somewhere at the far end of the table, a toast was made to the Queen, to the realm, to God. But beneath all the ceremony was the same truth that echoed in the tavern drink. Not because you are full, but because you are afraid. And now, as the sky darkens and your own breath slows, imagine a small inn at the edge of a forest. The fire is burned low, the mugs have been emptied and refilled. A traveller leans back in a wooden chair, eyes heavy, head tilted to the side. The innkeeper's dog curls beneath the table. Outside, the wind carries the scent of rain and earth. Inside, there is only the quiet clink of a last mug set down, the soft mutter of a prayer, and the echo of a world that drank to remember and drank to forget. Sleep now. Let the bitterness of the ale fade. Let the fear in the water drift away. And know that even in an age of swords and sugar, sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was raise a cup and drink. They gathered beneath ceilings of oak and candlelight, dressed in velvet and brocade, the weight of gold rings pulling at their fingers as servants moved like shadows between platters and goblets. The air inside those great halls was thick, not with smoke, not with perfume, but with something heavier, something rich and invisible, the scent of roasted meat layered upon meat, the smell of slow decay hidden beneath spices, too expensive to pronounce. This was not a meal. It was theatre. This was not hunger. It was hierarchy, plated and steaming. In the courts of the Elizabethan elite, Food was spectacle long before it was sustenance. Every dish arrived with intention, designed to impress, to signal, to remind everyone watching who belonged at the table, and who didn't. A roasted peacock, redressed in its feathers, its beak lacquered with honey, and its eyes replaced with polished glass, sat beside a roasted swan wings outstretched, as if in flight, even as its bones cracked quietly beneath its skin. There were pies filled not with fruit, but with entire birds, cakes the size of children, platters of veal, venison, goose, hare, lamb, pigeon. The animals changed, but the message stayed the same. We have so much. We can waste it. But the truth, hidden beneath layers of wine-soaked sauces and sugar-glazed bravado, was far less flattering. These feasts, these performances of power, were slowly killing the nobles who staged them. The very richness they praised was rotting them from the inside out. Every bite brought more than flavor. It brought pain. They consumed meat in quantities the body was never meant to bear 3, 4, 5 kinds per meal, day after day. And not lean cuts either, but fatty slabs of beef, thick ribbons of pork belly, organs and jellies and pressed meats, boiled in spiced wine. Vegetables, if served at all, were decoration. Greens were considered peasant food, too common, too bland, too close to the dirt. Bread, unless it was pure white and soft as silk, was ignored. Grains were filler. The meat was the crown, and the nobles devoured it with pride. But their bodies rebelled. The kidneys, overburdened with uric acid, formed stones sharp enough to cut screams from the mouths of lords. Gout, once called the rich man's disease, bloomed in their feet like fire. Their bellies swelled, not with strength, but with slow poisons. They spent nights sweating through sheets, their joints inflamed, their fingers unable to curl around goblets without pain. Physicians bled them. Herbalists brewed infusions, but the meals continued. It wasn't just the meat, it was the absence of everything else. Without fiber, their bodies slowed. Without vitamins, their minds fogged. Without the grounding humility of simple food, they lived detached from the land, floating on clouds of indulgence that dulled their instincts. And all the while, the poor watched with hollow eyes, knowing that while they had too little, the lords had too much and were dying from it. Even Queen Elizabeth, sharp as she was, could not escape the contradictions of the royal table. Her banquets were legendary, her tastes refined, her kitchen staffed with the best cooks in the land. But her teeth, blackened from sugar, her constant fevers, her thinning frame all hinted at a body exhausted by too much richness. She insisted on being seen eating peacock, on being presented with elaborate sugar sculptures, even when her appetite had long fled. Because a queen must appear strong, a queen must chew, even when she cannot swallow. The servants saw it all. They carried trays heavy with duck and pheasant, watched as half the food returned untouched, scraped it into troughs for the dogs or into baskets for the poor. They saw the nobleman's hand tremble as he reached for another bite. They heard the whispers about who could no longer mount a horse, who had taken to his bed with pains he would not name. The kitchen boys joked about pies that killed slowly, but beneath the laughter, they understood. Gluttony wasn't just sin, it was suicide served with a garnish. And yet, the feast went on, because stopping would mean admitting weakness. Declining a second portion meant confessing that you, too, were mortal. So they ate. Even when the food no longer brought pleasure, even when their bodies screamed for something simpler, the feast was never about nourishment. It was about proving that you could afford not to care. In private, some noble women tried to resist. They requested broth instead of boar, fruits instead of fowl, but their choices were mocked. A lady must eat like a queen. They were told, a weak appetite leads to weak rumours, and so they learned to eat and then to purge, to hide their uneaten bread beneath napkins, to feign illness during the heaviest courses, anything to survive the performance. Meanwhile, the poor ate scraps, the discarded bones and skin, the grease from the platters, the meat too old to serve to guests, and they were often healthier for it. Their diets, though meagre, included more grains, more roots, more watercress plucked from riverbanks. They could not afford the feast, but they also did not die from it. And so, the paradox deepened. Those with everything fell apart slowly, elegantly, surrounded by abundance. Those with nothing lasted longer, survival harder, and died with cleaner blood. As you lie back now, letting sleep curl around you like the steam of forgotten kitchens, imagine a long banquet table stretching into candlelit distance. The guests are draped in jewels. The platters are endless. The laughter is forced. At the far end, a man recess, goblet shaking in his hand. His fingers are red with gout. His smile is crooked from pain. But still, he toasts. Still, he drinks. Because to refuse would be to admit he has had enough. Close your eyes. Let the noise of the feast fade. Let the weight of the table lift. And remember this sometimes. The greatest punishment is not what is taken away, but what is given too freely, too often, and too long. The banquet is over now. The candles have burned low. The music has faded into dust. And the clink of goblets has been replaced by silence. The great halls are empty. The tables cleared. What remains is not the scent of spices or the echo of laughter, but the memory of what was eaten, and what it meant. For in Elizabethan England, food was never just food. It was a message, a mirror, a chain, a mask. It was survival for the many, and slow ruin for the few. You've walked through her kitchens now, haven't you? You've seen the turnspit dog running in circles, the communal ovens crowded with marked loaves, the noble woman hiding peacock meat beneath her napkin, and the poor woman standing in the market square, too forbidden from selling what her own hands had grown. You've watched the wine pour and the teeth blacken. You've heard the whisper of laws that punished a roast more harshly than a lie. You've seen a kingdom kept upright not by justice or love, but by fear, hunger, and ceremony. So now, in the hush before sleep, ask yourself gently, would you eat at her table? Not the fantasy table, the one with polished silver, velvet gowns, and the polite rustle of linen, but the real one, the one behind the veil, the one where power is plated beside decay, where the food looks divine but is laced with rot, where every bite feeds not only your body, but the story others tell about you. Would you eat when you knew the meat was killing you? Would you smile through a feast served with the same hands that withhold grain from a mother in the alley? Would you toast a queen whose sugar-laced smile had crumbled from the four-ma, inside out? Perhaps you would. Perhaps we all would. Because hunger doesn't always come from the belly. Sometimes it rises from the need to belong, to be seen, to have enough. Even if it costs you your body, even if it costs you the truth. But there is another table. A kidder one, no chandeliers, no sugar birds, just a cracked bowl of soup beside a hearth, a heel of dark bread shared between two hands, a sip of small ale poured without pride. No one is watching, no one is judging, and yet, somehow, the warmth lingers longer. The taste is simpler, but real. Elizabeth's table was grand. Yes. But it was also a stage, and every actor there queen, lord, baker, butcher paid a price to perform. And now, As your breath softens and your thoughts drift toward quieter dreams, leave the noise of the feast behind. Let the roasted swans and gilded pies fade. Let the rules fall silent. And picture, instead, a child asleep beside an oven, the smell of rye and ash still in her hair. She has not eaten much, but she is safe. And she is not pretending. Sleep now. The queen is gone. The table is empty. And in this moment, you need not choose between hunger and spectacle. Only rest. Only peace. And tomorrow, when you rise, may the bread be warm, the cup be kind, and the table finally be yours.